14. My name is Wendy Dixon. I'm 32 years old, and 3 weeks ago, in front of 30 guests at my parents' 40th wedding anniversary dinner, my father stood up, raised his glass, and announced that the whole family would be going to Hawaii for another celebration. And I remember everyone clapping, my sister practically jumping out of her chair with excitement, and I smiled too, because for the first time in years, I thought maybe I would finally be included in something. Maybe I would get to rest, to breathe, to feel like I belonged. But then I made one simple mistake. I asked what time our flight was, and the entire room shifted. My father looked at me like I had said something inappropriate. My mother's smile tightened just enough for me to notice. And then, without hesitation, he said, "You don't need to know, Wendy. You're not part of this trip. Someone has to stay behind and take care of the kids." And in that exact moment, with 30 people watching, I felt something inside me go completely still. Not broken, not shattered, just still. Like something had finally stopped pretending. What no one in that room knew was that I had been quietly building something for 3 years. Something that had nothing to do with them, something I never shared because I had already learned what happens when you try to show your family who you really are, and they decide it doesn't matter. So I kept it to myself. I kept everything to myself. And that night, standing there with everyone pretending not to notice what had just happened, I realized I didn't want to be invisible anymore. To understand how I got there, you need to know what it felt like growing up in my family, because on the outside, everything looked perfect. We lived in a beautiful house in the suburbs of Boston, the kind of house that tells people you've succeeded without ever saying a word. My father had a stable career. My mother dedicated her life to maintaining our image, and my sister Megan was always the one everyone celebrated, especially after she married Derek, a corporate attorney whose job title somehow became part of her identity, and they had 2 children, Oliver and Sophie, who instantly became the center of everything, while I slowly became background. The person who helps, the one who fills in the gaps, the one who shows up early, stays late, and never asks for anything. I worked as a part-time accountant, which in my family basically meant I had no real career, just flexible time that everyone assumed belonged to them. So holidays became my responsibility, birthdays became my responsibility, even random weekends somehow turned into obligations. And I didn't question it because over time, when you're treated like you don't matter, you start to believe it's easier not to argue, easier to just do what's expected, easier to be useful than to be seen. 3 years ago, my life fell apart in a different way when the man I thought I would marry sat me down and told me that I was just there, not special, not necessary, just present, and something about that broke through the numbness I had been living in, so I did something impulsive. I walked into a pawn shop and bought a used camera, and that camera became the first thing in my life that belonged only to me, something no one asked me to do, something no one expected from me, something I chose. I started taking photos of people no one else seemed to notice. People waiting, people working, people existing quietly on the edges of everything. And I created an anonymous page online where I shared those images, never telling anyone it was me, because I didn't want their approval. I just wanted to see if anyone else saw what I saw. And slowly, people did. They followed, they commented, they connected. And for the first time in my life, I felt like maybe I had something real. Then one day, I received an email from a gallery in California, and I almost deleted it because it felt impossible, like something meant for someone else. But it wasn't, it was real, and before I could even process what it meant, my family reminded me exactly where I stood in their world. After the anniversary dinner, after the humiliation I tried to pretend didn't hurt, I ended up finding emails that were never meant for me to see, messages between my mother and my sister, discussing how convenient it would be to keep me home, so I could take care of the children while they enjoyed their vacation, calling me free help, saying I had nothing important to do. And I remember sitting there staring at those words, not crying, not reacting, just finally understanding something that had always been there but never spoken out loud. I wasn't overlooked by accident. I was placed there, deliberately, comfortably, permanently. And in that moment, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet decision that I couldn't ignore anymore. So I left. I packed everything I owned that mattered. I got into my car, and I drove across the country. Not because I was brave, but because staying felt worse than leaving. And when I finally arrived in California, when I stood in that gallery and saw my war on the walls, something inside me came back to life in a way I didn't know was still possible. People didn't look past me anymore. They looked at what I created. They listened when I spoke. They asked questions. They cared. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to earn my place in the room. Then, on the night of my exhibition, just when I thought I had stepped fully into a new life, my family walked in, uninvited, unannounced, carrying the same expectations they had always had, asking me to come back, to help, to sacrifice, to return to the version of myself that made their lives easier. And I remember standing there, feeling the weight of everything I used to be, everything they still thought I was, and realizing I had a choice. For once, I chose differently. I told them no. Not angrily, not dramatically, just clearly, calmly, in a way I had never spoken before. And the room went silent, because people don't expect the quiet one to finally set boundaries. They don't expect the one who always says yes to suddenly mean no. And in that silence, something changed. Not just in them, in me. Because I finally understood that being needed is not the same as being valued, and being useful is not the same as being loved. Now I live by the ocean. I wake up early. I work. I create. I build something that belongs to me. And my life is not perfect. It's not easy. But it's mine. And for the first time, that feels like enough. And if you're listening to this right now, and something in this story feels familiar, if you've ever felt invisible, overlooked, or quietly pushed into a role you never chose, I want you to remember something simple but important. You are allowed to step out of that role. You are allowed to choose yourself. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is not fight, not prove, not explain, but simply walk away and build a life where you are finally seen. Ok, mình sẽ viết tiếp phần còn lại đầy đủ, giữ đúng văn phong liền mạch, câu dài, cảm xúc thật, dễ clone giọng, và đảm bảo có cao trào plus plot twist plus, giữ chân người xem đúng chuẩn video 35-43 phút. And just when I thought saying no would be the hardest part, I realized that leaving was only the beginning. Because walking away from a role you've played your whole life doesn't just change how others see you, it forces you to confront who you are without it. And that part, no one prepares you for. The first few days after my exhibition were strangely quiet. Not empty, but unfamiliar. Like stepping into a room where everything belongs to you but you don't quite know where to sit yet. And I remember waking up one morning in that small room above my Aunt Ruth's cafe, sunlight spilling through the window, the sound of the ocean somewhere in the distance. And for a moment I didn't move, because I realized something I had never felt before. No one was expecting anything from me that day. No one needed me to fix something, cook something, watch someone, prove something, and instead of relief, what I felt first was fear. Because when you've spent your entire life being needed, silence can feel like rejection, even when it's actually freedom. I started working at the cafe in the mornings, learning how to pour coffee properly, how to remember people's names, how to smile without feeling like I was performing. And the strange thing was, people here didn't treat me like I owed them anything. They said thank you. They asked how I was doing. They listened to my answers. And at first I didn't know how to respond, because I had never been in a place where I wasn't already expected to give more than I received. In the afternoons, I focused on my photography, editing, printing, preparing for what Marcus had already started calling my next chapter, and every time I looked at my work, I started seeing something I hadn't allowed myself to notice before. These photos weren't just about invisible people, they were about me, about years of watching quietly, understanding silently, existing in spaces where I wasn't acknowledged, and somehow turning that into something that other people could feel. But even as I built something new, the past didn't disappear. It lingered in small ways, in thoughts that crept in when I was tired, in moments when I caught myself wondering if I had overreacted, if maybe I should have handled things differently, if maybe I had been too harsh. And that's the part people don't talk about. When you finally stand up for yourself, doubt doesn't vanish, it gets louder before it fades. And then one afternoon, about 3 weeks after the exhibition, something happened that I didn't expect. I received a message from Derek. Not Megan. Not my mother. Derek. And at first I almost ignored it, because in my mind, Derek had always been background noise in my life, someone who benefited from the system but never questioned it, someone who took what was given without ever asking where it came from, but something made me open it. It was short. Can we talk? No explanation. No context. Just that. I stared at the message for a long time, debating whether to respond, because part of me knew that whatever conversation this led to would pull me back into something I had just started to escape, but another part of me, a quieter, more curious part, wanted to understand why. So I replied, "About what?" His response came almost immediately. "About what you said, and about what we didn't see." That was the first time anyone in my family had used those words. Didn't see. Not didn't understand. Not didn't agree. Didn't see. And something about that made me pause. We ended up scheduling a call later that evening, and I remember sitting by the window, phone in my hand, watching the ocean, trying to steady myself, because I didn't know which version of Derek I was about to speak to. The dismissive one I had always known, or someone different. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded quieter than I expected. "Wendy, I think we got it wrong." There was no defense in his tone, no arrogance, just a kind of discomfort that felt unfamiliar. "I didn't realize how much you were doing," he continued. "Not until you weren't there." I didn't respond immediately, because I had heard apologies before, not directly, but indirectly. Wrapped in excuses, softened by justifications, and I had learned not to accept words without understanding what they actually meant. "What changed?" I asked. There was a pause. Then he said something I didn't expect. "Hawaii." And then he explained. Without me there, everything fell apart in ways they hadn't anticipated, not because the situation was impossible, but because they had never learned how much I had been quietly holding together, from routines to small details, to emotional balance, things that don't seem important until they're missing. And for the first time, they had to experience the absence of something they had always taken for granted. "It wasn't just the kids," he said. "It was everything. Megan was overwhelmed. Your mom was frustrated. Your dad didn't know how to help. And I realized we had built our lives assuming you would always be there to make it work." That sentence landed differently, not as an excuse, as a realization. "And the emails?" I asked. He exhaled slowly. "They were wrong. Simple. Direct. No justification." And for a moment, I didn't know what to do with that, because part of me had expected resistance, defensiveness, something to push against, but instead, I was faced with something quieter: acknowledgement. "I'm not asking you to come back," he added. "I just thought you should know that we see it now." See it now. 3 words that would have meant everything to me once. But now, they felt different. Not empty. Just late. "Thank you for telling me," I said finally. And I meant it, not because it fixed anything, but because it was honest. We ended the call without any promises, without any expectations, just a conversation that existed on its own, separate from everything that had come before. And that night, I realized something important. Closure doesn't always come from apologies. Sometimes it comes from understanding that you don't need them anymore. A few days later, Megan texted again, but this time it was different from before, shorter, less demanding, more uncertain. "I saw your photos again. They're really good." No request. No pressure. Just that. And for the first time, I could read her message without feeling pulled back into old patterns, without feeling responsible for her emotions, without feeling like I needed to respond in a way that maintained peace. So I replied simply, "Thank you." Because that was enough. Not forgiveness. Not reconciliation. Just enough. Months passed, and slowly, my life stopped feeling like something new and started feeling like something real, something stable, something I didn't have to question every day. And the more I built it, the more I understood that what I had been missing all those years wasn't just appreciation, it was agency, the ability to decide how my time, my energy, my life would be used. My second exhibition came together with more confidence, more clarity, more intention, and this time, the theme wasn't invisibility, it was boundaries, the spaces where people decide what they allow and what they no longer accept. And every photo carried that idea in some way, quiet but firm, like a line drawn not in anger, but in self-respect. On opening night, I stood in the same gallery, but I felt completely different, not because the room had changed, but because I had. And as people moved through the space, asking questions, sharing thoughts, connecting with the work, I realized that I no longer needed their validation in the same way, because I had already given myself something they couldn't take away. And this time, my family didn't show up. Not because they couldn't, because they chose not to. And surprisingly, that didn't hurt. It felt appropriate, like a distance that finally made sense. Later that night, after the gallery had closed and the lights had dimmed, I walked outside alone, the ocean air cool against my skin, the sound of waves steady and constant, and I thought about everything that had happened, everything I had left behind, everything I had built, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was between two lives. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, not because it was perfect, but because it was mine. And if there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's not about leaving, it's not about proving anyone wrong, it's not even about success, it's about recognizing when the life you're living was never really yours to begin with, and having the courage, quietly, imperfectly, without certainty, to choose something different. Because being seen by others will never matter as much as finally seeing yourself. And just when I thought the story had finally settled into something quiet and stable, life did something unexpected again. Not dramatic, not explosive, but in that subtle way where everything shifts just enough to make you look back and realize how far you've come. It happened on a random morning. Nothing special about it. Just another day where I opened the cafe at 6, poured coffee, greeted regulars, wiped down tables, and for once I wasn't thinking about the past at all. I was just present, fully there in my own life, and that in itself felt like something I used to think was impossible. Around mid-morning, a woman walked in with 2 children, a boy and a girl, and something about the way they stood near the counter, unsure, slightly restless, felt familiar in a way I couldn't immediately explain. And then the boy looked up at me and said, "Do you work here every day?" And I smiled and said yes, and he nodded like that answer mattered to him more than I realized. The woman ordered quietly, polite but distant, and I didn't recognize her until she said my name, Wendy. I froze for a second, because I knew that voice. I turned fully and saw her clearly. Megan. She looked different, not in appearance, but in energy, less certain, less composed, like someone who had spent time sitting with things she didn't understand before. And beside her stood Oliver and Sophie, a little older, a little quieter than I remembered. For a moment, none of us spoke, not because we didn't have anything to say, but because we didn't know where to begin. "I didn't call," she said finally, almost apologetically. "I thought you might not answer." She wasn't wrong. "I'm here for a few days," she added. "Derek has a conference nearby, and I wanted to see you. Not, we need you. Not, you have to help. Just, I wanted to see you." That alone told me something had changed. I nodded slowly and gestured toward a table near the window. "Sit," I said. "I'll bring your coffee." And as I prepared their drinks, my hands moved automatically. But my mind was somewhere else, not in the past exactly, but in the awareness of how different this moment felt compared to everything that had come before. When I brought the coffee over, Megan looked around the cafe, taking in the details, the people, the small life I had built here, and for the first time, I saw something in her expression that I had never seen before. Respect. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind. "This is yours?" she asked. "It's my aunt's," I said, "but I'm part of it." She nodded, like she understood what that meant. Oliver tugged at her sleeve. "Mom, can we sit by the window?" And Megan looked at me, not to hand him off, not to ask me to take over, but just waiting. I smiled. "Of course." And we all moved together. No roles, no expectations. Just people. We talked, carefully at first. Small things. How the kids were doing, how the cafe worked, how long I had been there, and slowly, the conversation deepened, not because we forced it, but because there was finally space for it. At one point, Megan looked at me and said something I didn't expect. "I didn't realize how much of your life I never asked about." There was no defense in her voice, no excuse, just honesty. "I didn't realize either," I replied. "Not until I left." She nodded slowly. "I used to think you were just okay with everything," she said. "Like you didn't mind." "I thought that too," I admitted. And that was the truth. For a long time, I had convinced myself that accepting less was the same as being content, that staying quiet meant I was strong, that giving without question meant I was good. But in reality, it just meant I had never learned how to choose myself. Sophie, sitting beside me, suddenly leaned against my arm, completely natural, completely unplanned, and I felt something soften in my chest, not because I missed being needed, but because this moment didn't come with expectation. It wasn't something I owed, it was something I was choosing. And that made all the difference. Megan watched that moment quietly, then looked back at me. "I'm not going to ask you to come back," she said. "I understand now. I think." I didn't rush to respond, because understanding isn't something you prove in one sentence. It's something that shows over time, in actions, in consistency, in change. But I could hear the difference, and for now, that was enough. We spent the rest of the morning together. No tension, no pressure, just conversation that felt real for the first time. And when they finally got up to leave, Oliver turned to me and asked, "Can we come back tomorrow?" I looked at Megan. She didn't answer for him. She waited. And I smiled. "Yes," I said, "you can." Because this time, it was my choice. After they left, I stood by the window for a long time, watching them walk down the street. The ocean just beyond, the life I had built stretching quietly around me, and I realized something that took me years to understand. Walking away didn't destroy my family. It revealed it. It showed me what was real, what was broken, what could change, and what couldn't. And more importantly, it showed me who I was without it. And the version of me that stood there that morning was not the same woman who stood in that dining room 3 weeks before everything changed. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't waiting. She wasn't just there. She was present. She was choosing. She was seen. By others. And finally, by herself. If you've stayed with me until this moment, I want to ask you something, not as part of a story, but as something real. Have you ever been the one who gives everything, who holds everything together, who shows up every time without being asked, and slowly realizes that no one ever stops to ask what you need? And if that's you, what would happen if you stopped? Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of respect for yourself? Because sometimes, the most powerful decision you will ever make is not to prove your worth to people who already decided it didn't matter, but to walk away quietly. And if I'm being completely honest, even after everything that happened, even after I built a life that finally felt like my own, there were still moments when I caught myself wondering who I would have become if I had never left, if I had stayed in that house, in that role, in that version of myself that everyone else was comfortable with. Because the truth is, walking away doesn't erase who you were. It just gives you the space to decide who you want to be next. There are days when I still remember the small things, the routine of setting a table perfectly, the sound of my mother's voice calling my name from another room, the feeling of being needed in ways that felt exhausting but familiar. And sometimes, memory has a way of softening the edges of what hurt you, making you question whether it was really that bad, whether you could have just endured it a little longer, whether leaving was necessary. But then I remember the silence after my father told me I wasn't going to Hawaii, the way 30 people avoided my eyes, the way I stood there holding a plate like I didn't belong in my own life. And I remind myself that what I left behind wasn't love. It was expectation without respect. It was responsibility without recognition. It was presence without value. And once you truly see that, you can't unsee it. A few weeks after Megan visited the cafe, something else happened. Something smaller, but somehow just as meaningful. I received a letter in the mail. Not a text, not an email, an actual handwritten letter. And I recognized the handwriting immediately. My father. I sat with it for a long time before opening it, because letters carry weight in a way messages don't. They take time, intention, thought, and I didn't know what I was about to read, whether it would be another attempt to pull me back or something else entirely. When I finally unfolded the paper, the words were simple. Wendy, I don't know how to say this the right way, but I've been thinking a lot, and I realized I spent years being proud of the wrong things. I thought providing, maintaining, building a certain image was enough. And I didn't see what it cost you. I didn't see you, and that's something I regret more than I know how to fix. I saw the magazine again, and I kept it, not because of the photo, but because your name was on it. And I realized that might be the first time I've ever truly seen your name connected to something that was yours. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted you to know. I'm trying to understand. Dad. I read it twice, then a third time, not searching for hidden meaning, not looking for what was missing, just letting it be what it was. Imperfect, incomplete, but real. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to respond immediately. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood that I didn't have to rush to fix things anymore. I didn't have to manage emotions that weren't mine. I didn't have to make space for someone else before I had fully made space for myself. So I folded the letter, placed it on my desk, and let it sit there. Not ignored. Not rejected. Just held. Because healing doesn't always happen in conversations. Sometimes it happens in distance, in time, in quiet understanding that doesn't need to be explained right away. As the months passed, my life continued to grow in ways I never imagined, not in some dramatic overnight transformation, but in steady, meaningful progress, the kind that builds confidence not from external approval, but from repeated proof that you can trust yourself, that you can create something, sustain something, live something that belongs to you. My work expanded. My exhibitions became more focused, more intentional, and the series I created about boundaries resonated with people in a way that surprised even me, because it wasn't loud, it wasn't confrontational, it was quiet, reflective, honest, and maybe that's what people needed. Not another story about fighting, but a story about choosing. Choosing to stay, choosing to leave, choosing to change. Choosing to stop, choosing to begin again. And through all of that, I started to understand something that no one had ever taught me before. You don't lose yourself all at once. You lose yourself slowly, in small compromises, in quiet agreements, in moments where you say yes when you mean no. And over time, those moments become your life. But the opposite is also true. You don't find yourself all at once either. You find yourself in small decisions, in quiet boundaries, in moments where you finally choose differently, and over time, those choices become your life. Now, when I wake up in the morning and look out at the ocean, I don't feel like I escaped something. I feel like I arrived. Not at a destination, but at myself. And maybe that's the real ending of this story. Not the confrontation, not the gallery, not the success, not even the distance from my family, but the quiet realization that I no longer need to be seen by the people who refuse to see me, because I have already seen myself clearly. And once that happens, everything changes. If this story stayed with you, if something in it felt uncomfortably familiar, I want you to sit with that feeling for a moment. Not push it away, not ignore it, because sometimes the things that resonate the most are the ones we've been avoiding the longest. And when you're ready, ask yourself one simple question. Where in your life are you still saying yes when you really want to say no? Because the answer to that question might be the beginning of your own story, and build a life where it does. And if I stayed with that feeling a little longer, standing there by the window after they left, watching the outline of my sister and her children slowly disappear down the street, I realized something that didn't come to me in a sudden moment, not like a revelation, but more like a quiet understanding that had been forming for a long time, and was finally ready to be acknowledged, and that was this. For years, I thought my life was something that happened to me, something shaped by other people's needs, other people's expectations, other people's definitions of what mattered. But what I didn't understand back then was that every time I stayed silent, every time I agreed without thinking, every time I chose comfort over truth, I wasn't just accepting a role, I was actively building the life I felt trapped inside. And that realization is not easy to sit with, because it means that while I was treated unfairly, while I was overlooked and taken for granted, there was also a part of me that allowed it to continue, not because I was weak, but because I didn't know there was another way. I didn't know I was allowed to want more, to expect more, to demand something different. And once you see that, once you understand that your silence has been part of the structure you feel stuck in, it becomes impossible to go back to pretending you don't have a choice. I went back inside the cafe slowly, the bell above the door making that soft, familiar sound, and everything looked the same. The tables, the counter, the half-finished cups of coffee, the sunlight hitting the floor in the same way it always did, and yet everything felt different. Not because the world had changed, but because I had. And that's the part people don't talk about enough, the way your external life can look almost identical, while your internal world has completely shifted into something unrecognizable. I finished my shift that day like I always did, wiping down surfaces, stacking cups, exchanging small conversations with customers. But there was a calmness in me that hadn't been there before. Not excitement, not even happiness in the usual sense, but a kind of grounded certainty, like I was no longer waiting for something to happen. I was simply living inside something I had already chosen. Later that evening, I went upstairs to my room, sat down at my desk, and my eyes fell on the letter from my father again, still exactly where I had left it, and this time, instead of just reading it, I picked up a pen, not because I felt pressured to respond, not because I felt obligated to repair anything, but because I realized I finally had the ability to speak without fear of losing myself in the process. I didn't write quickly. I didn't try to sound perfect. I just wrote what felt true. Dad, I read your letter more than once, and I understand what you're trying to say, and for the first time, I believe you mean it. But I need you to understand something too. I didn't leave because of one moment. I didn't leave because of Hawaii. I left because of years of feeling like I didn't exist in my own life. And that doesn't disappear just because we finally talk about it. I'm not angry the way you might think. I'm just no longer willing to live that way again. And if there is going to be a relationship between us, it has to be different, not in words, but in how we show up, in how we listen, in how we respect each other's lives. And I'm open to that, but I'm not going back to who I was. I stopped there, not because I had nothing more to say, but because I had said enough, and that's something I had never allowed myself before, to stop speaking when the truth was already complete. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in an envelope, and left it on the desk for the next morning. Because even now, even with everything I had learned, I was still practicing what it meant to move at my own pace, to not rush decisions out of habit, to not respond just because silence felt uncomfortable. That night, I couldn't sleep right away, so I took my camera and walked down to the beach, something I had started doing whenever my thoughts felt too full, and the ocean was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty, but expansive, like it can hold whatever you bring to it without needing to change it. I sat down on the sand, the cool air brushing against my skin, and for a long time I didn't take any photos. I just listened, to the waves, to my breath, to the absence of noise that used to fill my life, and I realized that for the first time, I wasn't rehearsing conversations in my head. I wasn't preparing for someone else's reaction. I wasn't trying to anticipate what would be expected of me next. I was just there. And this time, being just there didn't feel like nothing. It felt like everything. Eventually, I lifted my camera and took a single photograph, not of a person, not of a dramatic scene, but of the horizon, that thin line where the ocean meets the sky, where one thing ends and another begins. And as I looked at it through the lens, I understood why it felt important, because that line wasn't a barrier. It was a transition, a space where two realities exist at the same time, not fully separated, not fully connected, just like me, still part of my past, but no longer defined by it. When I got back to my room, I placed the camera on the desk next to the old one I had bought years ago, the one that started everything. And for a moment, I just stood there looking at both of them, one representing who I used to be, uncertain, hidden, trying to find something to hold on to, and the other representing who I had become, someone who created, who chose, who stepped into her own life without asking permission. And I realized something simple, something that had been there all along but took me years to understand. Nothing about me was ever missing. Nothing about me needed to be fixed. The only thing that changed was that I finally stopped waiting for someone else to recognize my value before I allowed myself to live it. And maybe that's the part of this story that matters most. Not the conflict, not the distance, not even the success, but the quiet shift that happens when you stop asking, "Why don't they see me?" and start asking, "Why haven't I been seeing myself?" Because once that question changes, everything else follows. And if you're listening to this right now, if you've made it all the way to the end, I want you to take a moment, not to think about my story, but to think about your own, about the places where you've been silent, the roles you've accepted, the expectations you've carried without questioning. And I want you to ask yourself, gently, honestly, without judgment, what would my life look like if I chose myself? Just once. Not forever. Not perfectly. Just once. Because sometimes, that one choice is all it takes to begin. And just when I thought I had finally settled into a version of my life that felt stable, something deeper began to surface. Not in a way that disrupted what I had built, but in a way that asked me to understand it more honestly. Because the truth is, rebuilding your life doesn't just mean changing where you live or what you do. It means slowly untangling the parts of you that were shaped by survival and deciding which ones you want to keep and which ones you are finally ready to let go. And that process is quieter than people expect. It doesn't come with dramatic moments or clear milestones. It happens in ordinary days, in small choices, in the way you respond to things that used to define you. And one of those moments came unexpectedly when I realized that I no longer felt the need to check my phone every time it buzzed, no longer felt that immediate pull to respond, to fix, to explain, to make sure everything was okay for everyone else. And at first, that absence felt strange, like I had forgotten something important, but then I understood that what I had actually forgotten was the version of myself who believed that everyone else's needs came before her own. I started noticing it in other ways too, in the way I moved through my days, in the way I spoke to people, in the way I allowed silence to exist without filling it with apologies or explanations. And it wasn't that I had become distant or cold, it was that I had finally stopped performing, stopped shaping myself to fit into spaces that had never truly held me. And that shift, subtle as it was, changed everything. Because for the first time, my life didn't feel like something I had to manage. It felt like something I was actually living. And that difference is hard to explain to someone who has never experienced it. But once you do, you can't go back. Around that time, Marcus invited me to collaborate on a larger project, something more structured, more public, something that would take my work beyond the quiet recognition it had been growing into, and place it in a space where it would be seen on a different scale. And the old version of me would have hesitated, would have questioned whether I was ready, whether I deserved it, whether I could handle it. But instead, I found myself saying yes, not out of pressure, not out of fear of missing out, but out of a clear understanding that this was something I wanted, and that distinction mattered more than I ever realized before, because wanting something for yourself is very different from agreeing to something for others. As we began planning, I spent more time reflecting on the direction of my work, on what I wanted to say, on what I had already been saying without fully realizing it, and I came to understand that my photography had always been about more than just capturing unnoticed people. It was about presence, about what it means to exist fully in your own life without waiting for permission, and that idea started shaping everything I created, every image, every frame, every story I chose to tell. And the more I leaned into it, the more connected I felt, not just to my work, but to myself. But growth, even when it's healthy, has a way of bringing up what you haven't fully resolved yet, and there were still moments when I found myself thinking about my family, not in the same way as before, not with the same need or attachment, but with a kind of distance that allowed me to see things more clearly. And one evening, as I was sorting through old files on my laptop, I came across a folder I hadn't opened in years, photos from holidays, birthdays, gatherings, moments that once felt normal. And as I clicked through them, I noticed something I had never fully seen before. I was always there, always present, always contributing, but rarely centered, rarely acknowledged, rarely someone people looked at with the same attention they gave others. And for a moment, I felt that familiar ache rise again, not as strong, not as overwhelming, but still there, still real. And that's when something shifted again. Because instead of pushing that feeling away, instead of minimizing it or explaining it, I allowed myself to sit with it, to recognize it for what it was, not weakness, not self-pity, but truth. And there is a kind of strength that comes from facing your past without trying to rewrite it, from accepting that something hurt you without needing to justify why it shouldn't have. And in that moment, I understood that healing isn't about forgetting or moving on, it's about integrating what you've been through in a way that no longer controls you. A few days later, I received another message, this time from a number I didn't recognize, and for a moment I hesitated before opening it, not because I was afraid, but because I had learned that not everything requires my attention anymore. But something about it felt different. So I read it, and it was from my mother. Not the version of her I had seen at the door. Not the one who spoke in controlled, calculated tones, but something quieter, more uncertain. "I don't know how to talk to you anymore," she wrote. And maybe that's something I should have learned a long time ago. I read the message more than once, not because it was complex, but because it was unfamiliar. There was no demand, no expectation, no subtle manipulation, just a statement, simple and unfinished. And for a moment, I didn't know how to respond, because I wasn't used to communicating with her in a way that didn't involve roles, didn't involve patterns that had been established for years. And that's the thing about change. It doesn't just alter what you do, it changes the entire structure of how you relate to people, and sometimes that means there is no clear script to follow anymore. I didn't reply right away, not out of avoidance, but because I wanted to respond from a place that was real, not reactive. And that night, as I walked along the beach again, listening to the waves, feeling that familiar sense of calm that had become part of my routine, I thought about what I actually wanted, not what I felt obligated to say, not what would make things easier, but what was true for me now, and the answer wasn't simple. But it was clear. I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to re-enter the same dynamic under a different name, but I also didn't feel the need to completely shut the door either, because distance had given me something I never had before: perspective. So the next morning, I replied, "I don't know how to talk to you the way we used to anymore either, but maybe that's not a bad thing." That was all I said. No explanations, no conditions, no emotional labor beyond what I was willing to give. And when I sent it, I didn't feel anxious. I didn't wait for a response. I simply placed my phone down and continued with my day. And that, more than anything, showed me how much had changed, because I was no longer tied to the outcome of that conversation. I was simply participating in it from a place of choice. Time moved forward the way it always does, steadily, without asking whether you're ready or not. And as the weeks passed, my life continued to expand in ways that felt natural, not forced. My work grew, my confidence deepened, and the sense of identity I had been rebuilding started to feel less like something fragile and more like something solid, something I could rely on. And that's when I realized that for most of my life, I had been waiting for someone else to confirm who I was, to validate my place, to tell me that I mattered. And now, without even noticing when it happened, I had stopped waiting. One evening, after a long day of work, I sat in my room, looking out at the ocean as the sun set slowly over the horizon, and I thought about everything that had led me here. The years of silence, the moment at that dinner table, the decision to leave, the uncertainty, the fear, the slow rebuilding, the conversations, the distance, the change, and I understood something that felt both simple and profound at the same time. None of it had been wasted, not even the parts that hurt the most, because those experiences, as difficult as they were, had shaped the awareness I now carried, the ability to see clearly, to choose differently, to live more honestly. And maybe that's the part people don't always talk about. The idea that your past, even when it's painful, isn't just something to escape from, it's something to understand, to learn from, to integrate, not so you can justify it, but so you can grow beyond it without losing parts of yourself in the process. Later that night, as I prepared for bed, I noticed something small but significant. I didn't feel like I was waiting for anything anymore. Not for approval, not for recognition, not for someone to finally see me, because I had already done that for myself. And once that happens, the need for external validation starts to fade. Not completely, not all at once, but enough that it no longer controls you. And as I turned off the light and lay down, listening to the quiet sound of the ocean in the distance, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not excitement, not relief, but a steady, grounded sense of peace, the kind that doesn't come from everything being perfect, but from knowing that you are finally living a life that belongs to you. And if there's anything I've learned through all of this, it's that choosing yourself isn't a single decision. It's a series of small, consistent choices, made over and over again, especially in moments where it would be easier not to, especially in moments where the old patterns feel familiar and safe. Because real change doesn't happen when it's convenient, it happens when it's necessary. So if you're listening to this, if any part of this feels familiar, I want you to understand something clearly. You don't have to wait for a breaking point to change your life. You don't have to wait until you're completely exhausted, completely invisible, completely disconnected from yourself. You can choose differently at any point, even in small ways, even quietly, even without anyone else noticing. Because those small choices, over time, become something bigger than you expect. And maybe the most important part of all of this isn't what I left behind, or even what I built afterward, but what I finally understood about myself, that I was never actually invisible. I was just in a place where I wasn't being seen, and those are not the same thing. Because once you see yourself clearly, once you understand your own value without needing someone else to confirm it, you stop asking for permission to exist, and you start living in a way that reflects who you truly are. And that is where everything begins. And maybe that's where most stories would end, in that quiet understanding, in that steady sense of peace that comes after everything has finally settled. But the truth is, life doesn't really end in moments like that. It continues, not dramatically, not with some grand conclusion, but in small, almost invisible ways that slowly shape who you become next. And it was in one of those ordinary days, a day that didn't feel important at all, that I realized something had truly changed, not just in my life, but in me. It happened in the simplest way. I was standing behind the counter at the cafe, wiping down the same surface I had wiped 100 times before, listening to the quiet hum of conversations around me, the sound of cups being set down, chairs shifting, the soft rhythm of people living their lives. And for a moment, I stopped, not because something interrupted me, but because nothing did, and that was new. There was no tension in my chest, no background noise in my mind, no quiet pressure reminding me of something I needed to fix or someone I needed to take care of. There was just stillness, and instead of feeling empty, it felt full, like I had finally arrived somewhere I had been moving toward for a long time without realizing it. I looked around the cafe, at the people sitting by the windows, at the light coming through the glass, at the small details that once would have felt temporary, like something I was passing through, and I understood that this wasn't temporary anymore. This was my life, not a version of it, not a stepping stone, not something I had to justify or explain, but something real, something I had chosen, and that realization didn't come with excitement or celebration. It came with something quieter, something deeper, acceptance. For so long, I had measured my life by how useful I was, by how much I could give, by how well I could fit into what others needed. And without even noticing, I had built an entire identity around that, an identity that felt stable because it was familiar, but underneath it, there had always been something missing, something I couldn't name back then, and now I could see it clearly. It wasn't recognition, it wasn't appreciation, it wasn't even love in the way I used to think about it. It was ownership, not in the sense of possession, but in the sense of belonging to myself, of having a life that wasn't defined by someone else's expectations. And the more I stood there, the more I realized that nothing outside of me had actually changed that morning. The cafe was the same, the people were the same, the world was the same, but the way I existed inside it was completely different. And that's the part that matters. Not what changes around you, but what changes within you. Because once that shift happens, everything else starts to feel different, even if it looks exactly the same. Later that day, as I was closing up, turning off lights, stacking chairs, moving through the routine that had become so familiar, I caught my reflection in the glass of the window. And for a second, I just stood there looking at myself, not critically, not searching for something to fix, just looking. And it struck me how unfamiliar that feeling used to be, to see myself without judgment, without comparison, without that constant sense of not being enough. And in that moment, I understood something I had never fully understood before. I had spent years trying to become someone who deserved to be seen, when in reality, I had always been someone worth seeing. I had just been surrounded by people who couldn't recognize it. And that realization didn't make me angry. It didn't make me bitter. It made me free. Because once you understand that your value was never the problem, that it was the environment, the expectations, the dynamics that failed to recognize it, you stop trying to change yourself to fit into those spaces, and you start choosing spaces that reflect who you already are. And that shift, that quiet but powerful shift, changes everything. That night, I walked down to the beach again, camera in hand, the same way I had done so many times before. But this time felt different, not because the ocean had changed, but because I wasn't coming there to escape anything. I was coming there because I wanted to be there. And as I stood at the edge of the water, watching the horizon stretch out in front of me, I raised my camera and took another photo. Not of anything extraordinary, just the line where the sky met the sea, and as I looked at it through the lens, I realized why I kept coming back to that image, why it kept appearing in my work, because that line wasn't an ending, it wasn't a division, it was a meeting point, a place where two things exist together without needing to erase each other. Just like my life. My past didn't disappear. My family didn't vanish. Those years didn't undo themselves. But they no longer defined me. They were part of the story, not the whole of it. And that distinction made all the difference. I lowered the camera slowly, letting my arms rest at my sides, breathing in the cool air, feeling that quiet steadiness settle deeper inside me, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was in transition anymore. I didn't feel like I was becoming something. I felt like I already was. And maybe that's what this entire journey was about, not finding something new, not transforming into someone completely different, but returning to a version of myself that had always been there, waiting underneath everything I had been taught to believe. I wasn't invisible. I was just in a place where I wasn't seen. And the moment I stepped out of that place, everything changed. Not all at once. Not perfectly. But enough. Enough to build something real. Enough to trust myself. Enough to know that I don't have to go back. And if you've stayed with me until now, if any part of this story has felt familiar to you, I want you to understand something. Not as advice, not as a lesson, but as something real, something you can hold on to when things feel unclear. You don't have to wait for someone else to recognize your worth before you start living your life. You don't have to earn your place in a space that was never meant for you. And you don't have to explain yourself to people who have already decided not to understand you. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is step out of the role you were given and choose the life that feels true to you. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. And once you do, you'll realize something that changes everything. You were never just there. You were always more. You just needed to see it first. And now, you do. And even after all of that, even after the calm settled into something that felt steady and real, there were still moments when I caught myself standing in the middle of my own life, almost surprised that it belonged to me. Because when you spend years living inside expectations that were never yours, freedom doesn't always feel like relief at first. Sometimes it feels unfamiliar, like wearing something that fits perfectly but you're not used to the shape of it yet. And there were days when that feeling would catch me off guard. Not in a way that pulled me backward, but in a way that made me pause and notice just how much had changed. I remember one particular morning. Nothing remarkable about it on the surface. Just another early shift at the cafe, the sky still pale, the streets quiet, the kind of morning where the world feels like it's slowly waking up alongside you. And I was setting up the counter, lining up cups, checking supplies, moving through the routine with a kind of ease that had become second nature, when one of the regulars, an older man who came in almost every day, looked at me and said something so simple that I almost missed it. "You look different these days," he said. Not better, not happier, just different. And I smiled, because I didn't feel the need to explain it, didn't feel the need to justify what that difference meant. I just nodded and said, "I think I am." And that was enough, because for most of my life, I would have tried to define that change, to explain it in a way that made sense to someone else, to make sure it was understood. But now, I didn't need that anymore. I didn't need my experience to be validated by someone else's understanding. I could simply live it. That same morning, after he left, I stood there for a moment longer than usual, looking out through the cafe window at the street beyond. And I realized something I hadn't fully put into words yet. I no longer felt like I was waiting for my real life to begin. That thought stayed with me. Because for years, even when things looked stable, even when everything was technically fine, there had always been this underlying feeling that I was in between something, that I was preparing for a version of my life that hadn't started yet, that what I was living wasn't quite it. But now, there was no later. There was no one day. There was just this. And instead of feeling small, it felt complete. Later that afternoon, I found myself going through some of my recent photographs, organizing them, selecting pieces for an upcoming feature Marcus had been working on. And as I moved from image to image, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. The people I photographed still carried that quiet presence, that depth I had always been drawn to. But there was something else now, something subtle but undeniable. They didn't just look unseen anymore. They looked grounded, like they existed fully within their own space, like they weren't waiting for someone else to acknowledge them. And that's when it clicked. My work had changed because I had changed. For so long, I had been capturing invisibility, because that's what I understood, what I lived, what I recognized in others. But now, I was capturing something else too, something quieter but stronger, presence, the kind that doesn't depend on being noticed, the kind that exists whether anyone is looking or not. And that realization didn't feel like a breakthrough. It felt like a confirmation, like I had finally caught up to myself. That evening, as the cafe emptied and the sky shifted into that soft, fading light that comes just before night fully settles in, I closed up as usual, turning off the lights one by one, the familiar rhythm of ending the day grounding in a way I had never appreciated before. And when I stepped outside, the air felt cooler, the ocean just visible in the distance. Steady, constant, unchanged in the way it always is. I walked toward it without thinking. Not because I needed clarity, not because I was searching for something, just because I wanted to be there. And as I stood at the edge of the water again, I didn't reach for my camera right away. I just stood there, letting the sound of the waves fill the silence, letting my thoughts settle without trying to organize them. And after a while, I realized something that felt almost strange to admit. I wasn't thinking about my family. Not in that moment. Not at all. And that didn't come from avoidance. It came from release. Because the truth is, healing doesn't always look like forgiveness. It doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like the absence of something that used to take up too much space in your mind. And when that absence finally arrives, it doesn't feel dramatic. It feels quiet. Like something that used to weigh you down has simply stopped existing. I eventually lifted my camera, took one more photograph, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to remember this moment, not as a turning point, not as something significant in the way stories usually define significance, but as something real, something that marked the quiet shift from surviving to living. When I got back to my room later that night, I sat down at my desk, the same desk where I had written letters, read messages, processed everything that had led me here, and I looked around the space, at the small details that now felt familiar. The camera, the prints, the notes, the life I had built piece by piece, and for a moment I just sat there without doing anything, without reaching for something to fix or complete. And then it hit me. There was nothing left I needed to prove. Not to them. Not to anyone. Not even to myself. And that realization didn't feel loud or overwhelming. It felt simple. Final, in the best possible way. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to become someone. I already was. And maybe that's the part no one tells you when you spend years feeling invisible, that the moment you finally step into your own life, the moment you stop asking for permission to exist as you are, everything doesn't suddenly change around you. The world doesn't shift dramatically, people don't always understand, and your past doesn't disappear, but you do. You change, in a way that makes everything else feel different. And once that happens, you don't go back. Not because you can't, but because you no longer want to.